Lords joining me for today's live video. Today, as some people deduced in the chat and from the obviously from the title and description, we're talking about the theory behind a particular game. Even if you think that's not something you'd be interested in, I think that you might find it interesting because not only is it something that has a lot of math in it, but it also represents an interesting historical type of game theory, a type of testing and designing a certain type of game with a bigger batch of cards in it and a longer span and more players than any other game of its sort. In fact, the funny timing is that this game, Magic the Gathering, I already had mentioned in some of the previous streams that I wanted to mention a little puzzle related to it that I had been fiddling around with in my head lately, but it didn't fit fully in a previous stream. I said I'll dedicate a whole stream to that at some point. And then I just read that yesterday was the exact 30th anniversary of the first set ever coming from this game. And so I guess good timing. We'll pretend today is yesterday, and then even better timing. And it's funny because we already have talked about 30th anniversaries occurring. I turned 30 not long ago. We also talked about how the proof of Fermat's last theorem first being presented was 30 years from not long ago. Ooh, we got a cat. Hey, Sage. Ooh, that's a Sage back there. Sage. Oh, you see those little eyes for a second? There's a little Sage down there. So, today is a good time to chat about some of the theory and the puzzle I was working on with that, as well as show some of the really old cards that I have from the game. Because you see, I haven't played this game in a long time. So I said I recently turned 30, meaning the game came out about when I came out. And in my head and in previous streams, I'd been thinking of it as I maybe played from when I was 10 to 15 or so. But now, when I looked at some of the cards that I had, you see, they have little set things. So they'll say the set they came with. So, for example, this is one of the later sets that I was actually doing drafts of. It's a way of getting the cards that's like a group activity. That was how I got a lot of these cards, because you get to keep what you drafted after you do a draft. That's one of the more fun group-based ways and less expensive ways of enjoying the game. And although I haven't collected a card in a long time, most of these cards I don't feel like I wasted money on, because not only will they be useful props right now, but also because the activity of drafting was something that cost a similar amount to going out to the movies or something, and was a different sort of group activity I was into. But looking at the little sets of when I used to play, it was actually earlier than I realized. The latest set that I remember drafting came out when I was, now looking it up, like 11 or 12 or something. And the ones after that, I don't remember the sets of. So I guess I played more when I was like 7 to 12 or something, now when I'm looking up when the sets came out. And I also have some even older cards than that. So, like, when I started playing, the game must have been about 6 or 7 years old. I think I remember this one called 6th edition, so maybe 6 years old. But I also got some cards from a family friend. Shout out to my friend Nat. If he happens to be watching, we should chat again, Nat. This was one of the coolest gifts ever, was this old collection of cards from even older. Now, to anyone who is all like money-based about this thing, some people care about the money aspect, like some card just sold for $2 million. That's silly, although it did sell to the musician Post Malone, who's actually really into Magic cards. So that's actually kind of cool. He seems like a good guy, and he's like genuinely into the game. So out of all the people, to get the really expensive card doesn't seem that bad, but still, nobody should be buying a piece of cardboard for $2 million. And so to anyone who's all moneyed out, know that I don't have like a Black Lotus or one of the ones that is worth a ton of money. None of these cards are going to be worth in the hundreds of dollars. Maybe if I spend time filtering through them, I could find some like $5 cards, but they're all a little bent anyway because they've been through a lot over the years. So that would turn the $5 cards to $2 cards, and then would it even be worth the work? So no, there's no Black Lotuses or whatever in here. But there are still really old cards. So, like, this set was called Ice Age, and I actually have something funny related to that here. This set is, like, as old as... It came out in the actual Ice Age. That's obviously not actually true, but to any younger viewers, it probably seems that old. The Ice Age was something really long ago, and about as long ago was when they made the Ice Age set. But no, that one came out before I started playing, but was part of this thing. This one is maybe Antiquities might have been the name of this set. And this was closer to when I started play, a little before this one, like the Odyssey or a set or two before that. But all these cards do very interesting, random different things. There's been tens of thousands. How many? Let me look this up. How many functionally identical or functionally different, not functionally identical, Magic cards have there been? Because they reprint some of them, and sometimes they've even been reprinting them with other names to like fit in with other brands and make a lot of money and stuff. Any praise you hear me giving this is going toward the game designers and artists and not toward the bigger company in charge of this stuff. The bigger company in charge of this stuff is pushing out products left and right, trying to make a quick buck. So we're not praising the big company in charge for sure. But the designers do deserve some praise. And the artists and stuff. I used to read books based around the lore of all the things they would show in here and all the character names that get mentioned. And I was really into those books. Like some of my favorite fantasy books as a kid were the Odyssey trilogy and the Mirrodin trilogy of these books that were based on these. So here it says that how many total cards? It looks like there's somewhere in like 20 to 30,000 or maybe 40,000 amount of different cards. I can't see the exact amount, but it's in the tens of thousands of different cards they've had. And their goal is to kind of have them be consistent. And part of that consistency is... Well, actually, let me note this on the tab right here. To anyone who's doubting that this was an important game and that it's something notable to be studied in, like, a test of a certain type of game theory and what went right and what went wrong over 30 years of testing and expanding a card pool. Well, we can see that on Wikipedia's selected anniversaries, where these are the ones that show on the front page on a given day and say, on this day in history. And there's like a list of all them in a row, including the ones we're gonna get. So I can see the future. Wikipedia's front page is gonna say one of these later. But here we have... Okay, so last stream, I had a gag about how I kept accidentally saying 6, and then a copy of that, and then another copy of that, and we're like, when we have all the weird candles and stuff out here, some fans didn't like all this 6 blank 6s in the mix, so we better be careful about this one. This one looks like a trap from the universe on the 6th. So... anyway, on the 5th yesterday, we can see that these are some of the things they found notable on Wikipedia. For example, Henry I was crowned King of England, and somebody proclaimed themselves as the monarch of the Han Dynasty. And the, what was called the Beaver Wars, apparently. And... Wizards of the Coast released Magic of the Gathering, the first trading card game. Now that's interesting. When I saw that earlier before the stream when I'd pulled this open, and I was like, that's interesting. I got to look into that because I knew it was the biggest But I wonder what metric they're saying by which it's the first. But I suppose under the right metrics it was. So here, the other page I had up here was a place we can look up cards, so I can show you an example of other cards that will fit in to the challenges I'm mentioning. Because when we're talking about the theory of maximizing certain things, we might have to be discussing cards that are so powerful that they're too expensive for me to have, and cards that are newer than what I have, because I don't have any card that's within 15 years here. Now, there are a lot of other cards, and at some point later in the stream, if we're bored, we can just like flip through a bunch more cards. These are, I brought out a bunch of different old cards and medium cards, no new cards, but from the, I guess none of them are like medium cards. These are all from the first like 12 years out of the 30 years of Magic. But they show a lot of interesting strategy. Also, the reason I mentioned Ice Age there is I thought something funny to show was I got this. This must have been in the gift from my family friend and friend Nat, who had given me a bunch of his old cards when I was a kid. And this must have been in it because this was a set before I started. It's an Ice Age rule book. And it's funny to look at the rules, how they wrote the rules back in the day, because, boy, some things have changed. For example, if we use this for me to teach any new players about the game, well, we better make sure to pay attention to the more than 2 pages they spent describing the ability called banding. Now, I'll explain that one later for anyone who doesn't play Magic, but hopefully somebody out there plays Magic and gets my gag about banding being a somewhat absurdist ability in modern standards of they abandoned it by the wayside. It was not one they wanted to keep. So let me take a peek at our comments. Somebody is saying they're playing a mono blue merfolk. What that means, for anyone who doesn't know, is like cards have different colors. So there are 5 colors your cards can be. And you can also have ones that are no color, which are artifacts, for example. And you can have ones that are multicolored, which used to look like this bright gold thing, now look a little different of a border. They've changed the way they do the border many times over the years as well. And sometimes it reflects the game strategy. And sometimes it reflects them trying to tell the story or maintain the in-universe feel of the card more. And at other times it reflects them trying to just make it as clear as possible from a gameplay standard. And there's a little bit of a clash that is inherently at play when they're working with trying to build some lore out of the cards, but also wanting it to just be easy to read and stuff. Now, where's the last color? These are the 5 colors you get. And there are the 5 colors on the back right there. And they each have different things that they're known for. Like, blue is more likely to get things that draw cards or that block opponent stuff and, like, subtle, like, little manipulations. Black is more likely to, like, suck life out of something. Green is more likely to have what's called a creature or, like, to boost up the creature. Yeah, white is more likely to be like protective or gain life. Red is more likely to like deal damage to something or attack quickly with a small thing. So they have different traits that are known for the colors, and you can have multicolored cards of different combos. If anyone wants their own mathematical challenge, you could note something I'll mention in a future video that you could try and deduce yourself now is, well, if we can have cards that are like green and red, based on they have those 2 types of color within them, and we could have ones that are these 3 colors, those 3 colors, these 4, all 5, none. Well, why is which types of color and how many you can have, of how many different types I can have, like I can have 5 single colors, how many 2 color combos, how many 3 color combos and such. Why is that a row in Pascal's triangle? Well, that's something you guys could think about on your own. If you want, I will cover it later. I thought that was fun to note. Now, with these cards, another thing to note for people who don't really know how the game works is there's different card types. So it's not just like different colors, but any color can have card types. There's also ones that don't really have a color but can create color stuff, like lands. They used to say this thing, now they just have a symbol. But these are some old school lands. This is when they accidentally broke lands by making artifact lands, which accidentally made some things too powerful. This was one of the lessons they learned. If they could have a time machine, the Magic designers wouldn't have made artifact lands, or they would have made them have a downside, like comes into play tapped or something, because they ended up being too powerful in conjunction with other things. They ended up being sort of like, well, why wouldn't I use one of these instead of a normal land? They have way more upsides than downsides in a lot of decks that were around in the Mirrodin block. And so you don't really want to make a card as a game designer that is like obvious you'd want to put it in your deck. You want cards that fit into different sorts of decks and work in different ways. So basically decks are typically 60 cards in the typical format. There's other formats. And you're restricted to up to 4 of a card. It hasn't always been that way, as we'll get into in a minute. But currently, in the main types of formats, there's another popular one that involves you have 100 cards, and there's only 1 copy of each, and one's called your commander. Whatever, that's one that's pretty popular, but I'm talking about the main classic one where you have 60 cards in your deck is the current rules, and you can only have up to 4 of each card. And in a tournament, you also get these extra 15 cards called your sideboard that are in between matches. You could switch them for stuff in your deck so that you can like work with whatever your opponent's strong or weak suits are. Now, like as a human, you could have one that's good at you find the opponent's weak suit in terms of like human ability, and then you find the card that taps into what they don't know how to think about. No, I mean like the cards in their deck, whatever the weak points are, the cards in their deck, you might substitute something in to deal with. And here, the types of card and the way you win is like you usually need a bunch of things that are typically lands that create this resource called mana or mana. You'll hear some people pronounce it mana, some call it mana. I've called it mana because maybe that's like it's another word that does have an actual word root that mana is a slightly more historic pronunciation. A lot of people call it mana, but I'm going with the one that's a little more historic. Now, those are like a cost that you use to play other stuff and to do other things. And this is going to be important for the challenge I'm going to mention in a bit, is that if I only have the mana making things, I can't do anything to my opponent. They're just like for making resources. But if I only have things that do things on the board, pretty much all of those cost an amount of mana, and then I can't play them. So you need to balance your deck if you're designing a deck. If I make a 60-card deck, there will be somewhere around 1/3 of it will be these things called lands, probably, or another mana-making thing. And then the other, 2/3-ish of the cards will be a mix of other things. You can have creatures that stay in play and have a power and toughness. The first one's how much they attack for, kind of. The second one's like how much they can take in damage, their health, sort of. And you can have spells of sort. Well, those are called spells too, a creature spell. But you can have other sorts of spells like instants and sorceries, which that's a game design thing that they wish they could have changed. I read something written by one of the main game designers who said, Mark Rosewater said that if he could go back in time, one of the main things he would have done different about the game, apart from just like not printing some of the cards that were way too good that they accidentally printed, one of the main bigger scale things would have been to, instead of calling instants and sorceries 2 different types, to call it an instant sorcery and have there be non-instant sorceries. They're very similar. They both are things that you can... Instants you can play whenever. Sorceries you can only play at a given part of your turn. And so like an instant you could play on your opponent's turn or like in reaction to something. but they both just like happen and then go to your dead zone called your graveyard. And other things stay in play until they get killed somehow. And those might be a creature, or they might be called an artifact or an enchantment or something like that. And your end goal is usually going to have to be deal 20 damage to your opponent. And basically, you each have 20 life, and there's some cards that can give an alternate win condition, like you win if this weird thing happens and you have this card out. But they usually underpower those cards on purpose. So usually like the best tournament decks get there by reducing the opponent's life total the classic way. And there's another way you could lose is if you have no more cards in your deck and you try and draw and you can't draw, you lose. And you deal them damage by attacking with creatures or by playing spells or by doing different things. You can also regain life and things. And it's one interesting note about them trying to design the game back in the day is they made a cycle of cards that, let me try and pull these up. They made a cycle of cards in the very first cycle that the reason I thought of this is because this is one of them, not from the very first set, but it's a reprint of one from the very first set. And they still reprint this one, or at least they did for many years. And the reason they reprinted this one again for many years was because it was a balanced enough card. It wasn't too bad and it wasn't too good. It was an interesting card for people to play. This bottom thing is just a quote for flavor and to add to their universal stories and stuff. But basically, it costs 1 green mana. It is an instant, and what it does is gives one of your creatures, or for some reason if you wanted your opponent's creature, +3 power and +3 toughness until end of turn. That was a balanced card, but it actually came from a cycle of cards that were in the very first set ever. And let me get these up. Here they are. Well, I got the names here. I'll just search them one by one. So, okay, I'll pull them open real quick. Basically, what these have in common is that they all cost 1 mana. They were all in the very first set ever, even though the pictures I'm pulling up might show reprints of them. And they all cost 1 mana and do something related to 3 of something in one of the colors. Sometimes they make what they call a cycle, where you'll have 1 card in each color that does a similar-ish thing. Now, these are all different things that these cards do because they relate to what the color specializes in, sort of. At least in this case, they really worked with that. So like Giant Growth here was the green one of this cycle, and it adds 3 power and toughness to a creature. That's a very green thing out of what their things do, is to make a creature bigger for combat on the battlefield. And now the other ones are an interesting lesson they learned in balancing mechanics of the game, because they thought each of these would be close enough to balanced. They may have known, some of them may have been made what you call a common, an uncommon, or a rare, but that sometimes has to do with the experimentalness of the card more than the power at times. And they thought all these cards would be close enough to each other in consistency. They each did a similar thing that each color specializes in. But it turns out, so Giant Growth is a good replayable card, but then you get the white one that is target player gains 3 life or prevent 3 damage. They thought this would be balanced. For example, they thought this would be as good as the red one. Lightning Bolt deals 3 damage to any target. This deals 3 damage to an opponent or one of their creatures. But this card is so much better. Oh, no, wait, I don't have it open here. Let me shrink myself. Lightning Bolt here, this was the white one. The target player gains 3 life or prevent 3 damage that would be dealt. And the Lightning Bolt deals 3 damage to any target. This is so much better than this one. This one, they thought at the beginning of the game that gaining life was a lot better than it was. But it turns out that when you play a card to gain life, you used a card. And if the life gain was just stalling them attacking, like, it's only going to be helpful if they've been really shrinking your life. And in that case, it's only buying you a little time and using a card to do that. It's almost like giving up your turn apart from stalling a little bit of the damage. And so it turns out that removing someone else's thing fully from the board is a lot more powerful than one time preventing them from killing one of your things. And this one is a slightly overpowered card. They've made weaker versions of it, whereas this one is a way underpowered card. But then they get to some pretty overpowered ones. This one is a bit too strong. It costs 1 black mana, and it adds 3 black mana. That doesn't sound that bad, but getting mana for basically free, because if you have this, then you get 2 more for free, turns out to be way too good. It lets you accelerate right at the beginning and play turn 3 stuff on turn 1. And when you get that head start, it turns out to be a lot better than they realized. Now, so that one's extra too good, but then you get to the blue one. Target player draws 3 cards. They thought this would be, not too much better than target player gains 3 life. Boy, were they wrong. This, some people would argue, is the greatest card ever printed. Like, if you were only allowed one of the really old, overpowered cards in your deck, the most expensive card ever, called Black Lotus, would certainly get a possible thing on the list. It costs 0, and it adds 3 mana of any color you want. And it was way too powerful. It lets your first turn go crazy if you start with it. And I would debate, in my opinion, I'm not a pro at the game, I haven't played it in a really long time, but I would debate this card's even better. And this card could be like the best card they've ever made. And there's actually one I've heard an argument for that you used to play for ante was allowed. I wonder if that's in the rule book. I bet it is. You'd bet your cards, and then they stopped doing that. But there's like one that's for ante called Contract from Below that's also insanely way too good. There's also one called Time Walk that is pretty insanely busted, but in general, I would say this one could be considered the best card in the game. It doesn't seem like much, but to draw 3 cards for almost no cost, it is 1 card. So if I had a card that says draw 1 card, it would do like nothing. If it costs 0 and lets me draw a card, it would actually be really good because it's like a blank spot in my deck. Then my 60 card deck gets free spots that filter to the next one. But if it costs like any amount of mana and just says draw 1 card, it's not really going to be worth it to replace the card I already have. It costs a card. But then you get to draw 2 cards and you get an extra one. Draw 3 cards, you're getting 2 new cards more than the amount that replaces it. And it turns out this is unbelievably good to have card advantage. Cards are everything. If you have enough cards, then you have enough of your mana stuff and your non-mana stuff. And this card was just so many levels beyond any of the other ones, even in this cycle, even these ones that are really good. They messed up with this. This is one of the ones that pretty much any tournament format either bans or restricts in some way. Now, those are some notes about some game theory stuff that has happened with it in the past. It's getting mighty dark here, and I might have to consider grabbing some more lights in the background of some sort, but we'll do that in a minute when I have to go to the bathroom. We'll continue a little further first. And basically, when you're constructing a deck, I said you need about 1/3 of them to be lands. You also need the other cards to play really interestingly in a certain sort of win condition or strategy. Like, maybe my strategy is I want to have a lot of small creatures that I play really quick, and then use things like giant growth to make them really big and attack the opponent. And maybe part of my strategy is to have some other spells that give the creatures certain sorts of evasive abilities that make them harder to block so they can deal direct damage to the opponent or things. Maybe my win condition relates to a combo. Maybe there's 2 cards that work really well together. And my goal is, if I can get those 2 cards out, I probably will win. So I just need to find a way to get those cards out. I just need to have my other stuff, have a lot of stuff about searching your deck or drawing a bunch of cards or things like that. As you may guess, since drawing 3 cards is incredibly broken, cards that go, search your deck for a so-and-so, are also usually really overpowered. But it depends how much they cost, because you could make a card that said, win the game, and if it costs like 20 mana, and it said you have to play it from your hand and pay all the mana, you can't sneak it out somehow, that wouldn't be played, because it's hard to get that much mana before you've lost. You know, you have to be working on defending and attacking in the first couple turns even. And so by the time you get to like something that costs like 6 or 7 mana, you can start doing crazy stuff. But these ones, if they cost 1 or 2, it's overpowered. Those are actually the cards we're looking for a challenge I'm going to mention in a minute that I was working on, are the overpowered ones. Because it is interesting to see in certain older tournaments, some of these cards that are way too broken, they don't fully ban. They let players have 1 of them in their deck instead of up to 4. And let's even flash back and note that not long before this rulebook was made, it wasn't 60 cards as the mandatory. In fact, there's a small chance this was even after that, but I don't think so. I'm just checking if this was, just making sure this was even after they confirmed you need 60 cards. I'll have to look and double check that, because in the early days of the game, they didn't know how big it would blow up. They didn't know people would be able to have like tons of a single card and whatever combo of the cards they wanted. So they didn't have any restrictions on how many of the card you could have. You could have like 6 in your deck. You could have like 8 of these in your deck of the same name if you wanted. And the deck size that they would play was often 40 cards. And with that, there are ways that you could design things that almost always win. Back in the day, people will say pretty quickly, you could design one that always wins. But until they printed certain cards, I don't think you could design a 40 card deck that always wins, even with an infinite amount of stuff, because you hit a certain restriction. If I have more, you draw 7 cards at the beginning, and let's say I go first. Well, if I have 7 cards that cost mana, then I can't play anything on my first turn. And if I have 7 cards that make mana and don't do anything that lets me draw more cards, then with lands, you're only allowed to play 1 land a turn. Even if there were other stuff, the mana makers usually don't have enough on their own to kill the opponent. If anything, they're usually the fuel for your stuff. So if I have 7 or more of these, I'm screwed, and 7 or more of these, I'm screwed. So when you'll read online about the old style of 40 cards and no limit, a lot of people will say, you can make a deck that always wins like this. But their deck lists don't always win, because we can come up with a list of 7 of the cards from it that if you drew those 7, you wouldn't win. And I mean, they say it always wins on the first turn. So that your opponent can't even respond. Now, there are newer things that are sort of like ways in which if your opponent went first, you might be able to play a thing that doesn't cost any mana by removing something else in your hand from the game and playing something that counters their thing. And funny enough, counter, based on one of their cards called Counter Spell back in the day, is how they say the type of spell that stops one of their things from happening. But you also put what's called a counter, like a little item to mark something on the cards. And even from the beginning, from the Ice Age era, they somehow stumbled into this discrepancy of needing 2 different words counter to mean different things in the game. They have a little like glossary back here, and they only have like 20 words in the glossary, and 2 of them are counter. Counter verb and counter noun. Because counter verb is countering a spell or effect means preventing that spell or effect from being cast. Countered spells go to the graveyard. The caster of the countered spell still has to pay the casting cost. A countered spell isn't successfully cast. Sounds a little redundant, some of that stuff they said, but sure. Now, counter noun means a counter is a marker used as a reminder on certain cards. Counters can be coins, poker chips, beads, pieces of paper, or whatever you like. See also token. Now, here, with this deck construction, they have developed cards now that if you were allowed to have any amount of each card in your deck, if there was no only up to 4 of each restriction, you'd be able to always win on the first turn if your opponent didn't have one of those magical tricks up their sleeve. If they did, it becomes a sort of rock, paper, scissors-ish match. The counter-spelly person beats the quick damage person, but this person beats the counter-spelly person, and this person beats that person. So, to look at the math of a deck that always wins, I thought it's okay enough to make the assumption, if we're just looking at a given deck, not as far as this is design this deck for a tournament. Because in a tournament, you're going to want a lot of counter spells on your own and stuff. But in a hypothetical bubble, to look at the math, if an opponent doesn't have any magical tricks up their sleeve that can stop your stuff from happening when they haven't even gone yet, and you go first, can you always win on the first turn with a deck? And, of course, most people will say, no, that's ridiculous. But if you didn't have the 4-card limit, you could. And the way you can do that is this card called Chancellor of the Dross, or there's other ways. If you didn't have the 4-card limit, you could make it work. But there's even, and this, the reason I'm not going to go too deep into these is because sometime when I've done more research on this puzzle that I've mentioned to you guys, and when I get like a little more answers about the puzzle, I'm going to make a main episode about this on my combo class channel at some point about the puzzle once I've investigated it more. And in that puzzle, I'll go into a little more in depth about how if you didn't have the 4-card limit, there are ways to always win on the first turn, assuming they can't counter you out of some special arrangement they happen to draw, and happen to have the exact right cards in their deck in the right conjunction and draw, which could happen in these tournaments, but we got to assume some things to have any amount of room to make a math puzzle. Now, if you allow any type of card ever printed, even with the 4-card maximum, you can always win, because there's these certain types of sets that were designed just for drafting or just for something or another. And I don't mean these sets that are called like Unglued and something or another. Those sets are joke sets they've made. I don't know if with those you could always win with a 60-card deck and the 4-card limit. That, if anyone knows, let me know. But I do know if you use these things called conspiracy cards that were made for drafting. I looked into it. I spent an hour looking at a comically bad deck you could design that would always win on the first turn if you were allowed to use these conspiracy cards, because they're not designed for constructing a deck. They were for a certain type of drafting experience. So you have to make more limits than some people realize, because if you allowed those conspiracy cards, you could make a deck that always wins on the first turn. And I'll show when I make an episode that one of the ones I came up with is comically bad. I came up with a deck that out of the 60 cards, only 6 of them matter, and you could make the rest of the cards in the deck whatever you want. And if you use the conspiracy cards and you have enough of those, then it like worked to always win on the first turn. So we have to say that you're not allowed to use the conspiracy cards, and that you need a 4-card limit, like has been instilled. At that point, to make a 60-card deck is impossible. And, you know, you can't make a 60-card deck that always wins. You can make a 7-card deck that always wins, because if you drew the right opening hand, sometimes you could always win on the first turn. So a 7-card deck, knowing if you went first, then you just draw your 7 and always win. You could arrange one of those, and not a 60-card. And most people stop the questioning there. But it made me wonder, where's the cutoff? What is the largest deck that would always win? And this is a number. that will expand over time as they introduce certain cards into the card pool. Where is that number currently at? And are we going to someday be dangerously close to 60? Now, of course, in actual formats, many of these cards would be banned or restricted, meaning that in even the really loose formats, you may only actually get one of some of these cards. But we're going to say we're going from the loosest format you could imagine, which is up to 4 of any card, but you can't use those conspiracy things or it's too easy. Up to 4 of any regular card that's been printed, and we'll say you don't get those unset joke cards too, but I don't even know if those would help. What is the biggest size of deck that would always win? Now, that was something I pondered a couple weeks ago, and my first thought before I looked into it, and I could not find much info about this online. Everybody talks about a lot of the stuff I said earlier about, you know, these decks that almost always win that you could construct, or you can't do it with this, but I haven't seen any talk about not requiring 60 cards and saying, what is the biggest amount of cards you could do with the 4 card limit? This also, of course, raises, as the math of it, you could say, what if we had a 3 card limit? What if we had a 5 card limit? But we'll do 4 card limit, like is pretty typical. And if you were playing what we could call an unrestricted vintage game, where you're up to 4 of any card that's the basic types, how far could we go? And maybe even that's not enough, because they've made these double-faced cards, and we might need to allow those. So I don't even know if vintage allows double-faced or requires typical back, but with all the typical cards, I think the only ones we need to kick out are the conspiracies, or maybe these ones called plane chase. There's only a few times they've made ones that were not designed to be in the big card pool. And it was a little rabbit hole I've been having fun thinking about some nights. And I kept making little innovations. I kept being like, here's how big I can make a deck that always wins. Can I get it bigger? Yep, I can get it 1 bigger. Yep, I can get it 1 bigger. Each 1 card you add is hard. And it doesn't add 4 of those cards, because you don't know you're going to use 4 of each of the cards. You have to do it very carefully to assume that if they can't randomly counter you with anything, and you go first, you will always win on the first turn. You have to look at the worst case scenarios. You have to look at, is there any way for my deck to be ordered in a way that the 7 cards I draw, and or if I have drawing spells, the order of the rest of them wouldn't let me win on the first turn? Because if there's even a single way that it can't, then we can't allow that deck in our challenge. Now, I have to run to the bathroom real quick. I'll also grab some sort of light to brighten it here, maybe some candles or something, and we'll be careful to try not to burn these things by accident. Leave any comments about any thoughts you have or anything. If you're an old Magic player, leave a comment about which cards you think I might use in my deck. And if you're a new Magic player, leave... And remember, this is not a deck you would use in a tournament, because our goal is assuming they don't have counters, and assuming we don't have to counter them, and assuming it's all taking place on the first turn. So our deck's not set up to win properly. If that doesn't go off, it has to go off. Now, we can assume that if you were to turn this into a really good deck, you'd use the rest of your 60 cards on things like counter spells and stuff. But if you're a new player, leave a comment if anything there confused you or that you are curious about having explained more. Now, I suppose what I'll leave the camera on will be a variety of old cards here on the table. And then you can have a glimpse at some random cards that are around here. So these are some old types of cards that used to be around. There you go. Some old cards. Now, I will be back soon. Where's my phone? Because I need the flashlight on it. Is my phone inside? Uh-oh. I need to always remember to get a flashlighty thing before it gets dark. Here it is. Okay, cool. I'll be back soon. Alright, welcome back to my combo lords. Whoa, animal sounds. What was that? Okay. Sounded like some sort of animal. Let's hope it was a cat or a squirrel. Now, I did bring some nuts for the squirrels, so gotta remember, but while I'm out here, leave some nuts in the background. For example, I said I was going to lure them a little closer. Ooh, this one has broken glass. Careful. Leading them a little closer. So we'll put one there, and we'll put one here. That'll be a fun challenge for the squirrels to get. Now, I'm going to take a peek at our chat for a minute. I didn't find any good candles, but brightening the screen there should do the trick. Now, thank you all for joining me. And, oh no, a mosquito. Those are bad. Let me try and get it. Oh, okay. Somebody here, Stick, says he is into elf decks. That relates to how certain cards... I wonder if I have an elf here. Yeah, I do. I have an elf. So, elves are a certain creature type. And sometimes you'll get other cards that relate to that, like a tribe. Like they'll say, all elves you have in play get +1/+1, or elves you have, you get trample or something. And so you'll be motivated or incentivized to put together a deck that has a certain tribe as its sort of creatures. Although sometimes that doesn't come into play, and your creatures are ones that work well in other conjunction with each other, or you might have none. Now, somebody says, George says, we could illuminate our way by biting certain mints in the dark, creating a spark of visible light. We should try, and it's called triboluminescence or triboluminescence. That's a cool reminder. I remember hearing that a while ago. And I've eaten the lifesavers before, and I wasn't in a dark enough place. So I need to get some of those again and test those out. That sounds like a great experiment for a nighttime stream. Now, looking around here, somebody says probably something with dark ritual and tendrils of agony, or perhaps grape shot. Now, it is true that one of my I don't use all of those. One of my deck ideas sort of uses Tendrils of Agony. However, I did play with my maximal deck idea that I currently had, that I've justified in terms of mostly proven to myself that it works. I did like a rough... It's hard to prove that one of these decks I've created, say you have a 20-card deck, that it always wins, because you have to look through all these different combinations, and it becomes a logic puzzle to prove it. You have to say, well, what are the options? I could either start with drawing one of these or start with not. And if I do, then these are options from there. And if these are like chains of options, that you have to make sure every one leads to I won on the first turn, assuming they couldn't do something crazy. Now, here we have... somebody says Street Wraiths and Gitaxian Probes will boost your deck size, and you are correct. And by the way, to the Combo Class bonus sequel, it's true, I appreciate having you around here, but it looks like one of my mods here did warn you to stop spamming stuff. I didn't see what it was, but, you know, folks, so if you get warned by a mod to stop spamming, you know, make sure to listen to my combo lords who know what they're doing in terms of the helping out of our composite combination around here. In any case, still glad to have you around. Just make sure not to spam everybody. And here we have a lot of cool comments. Somebody says, is serum powder allowed? That could make things interesting. Now, it is. However, it didn't end up helping here because serum powder ends up removing itself from the game with other cards. It removes the hand from the game. It's sort of a way to recycle your hand at the beginning, but it removes the other cards from the game. So if you got a combo of cards that almost worked for your combo, but not quite, then you'd have to remove them from the game. And it would be hard to guarantee that what you had left would fit. So, Serum Powder is a good one to look into if anyone looks further into this challenge. You don't even need to play Magic to go further with the challenge, because I am going to end it with a few ways I think it could be expanded that I haven't proven which one works yet. But another way to expand it could be Serum Powder, but I couldn't find a way around it removes the other stuff from the game and makes it too tricky because of that. There's also ideas where if you remove stuff from the game and you have other copies of them, you can get the exact same hand. Like, you can mulligan at the beginning of the game and then end up with one less card. But we don't even need to ban mulligans or consider them here either way, because you could mulligan and get the exact same hand back with one less card. And that's certainly not going to win if the other one did, unless somehow you have a thing that relies on you starting with less cards in your hand. But we have to look at the worst case scenario. So a mulligan thing it often wouldn't help, because you could end up with the same thing you had already had, or remove other stuff from the game, but still could help. And other thoughts here, one of them does sort of use this card called Tendrils of Agony, but it uses it in a way, in one of my better ideas, in the sideboard, which sounds weird because normally you don't use the sideboard in your normal deck, but I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. First, we're going to look at how, and to anyone who ends up spacing out early and can't follow all this, this will be an episode on the main combo class channel at some point once I've gone a little further with the logic. I will edit this all down in a nice way, but right now, I want to tell you where I'm at in the process. Spoiling the number will just show what we're leading towards, is that it's about 20 to 21 cards that I know will help us. Now, somebody here noted these ones called Gitaxian Probe and Street Wraith, and they're very correct on those being important. Those are in this deck, and here's why. These are cards that are close to what I mentioned earlier. A 0 cost draw 1 that just replaces itself as a card, but costs none. They haven't made that exact card, and they won't, because if you had a 60 card deck and you had 4 of those, it's like having a 56 card deck in almost every way, where if you draw it, you just replace it with the next. It's almost like blank in most contexts. So, looking at these cards, they have a little cost. They each basically do that, and we'll look at them on here. They basically do that thing of recycling themselves for a new card at the cost of 2 life. Now, you only start with 20 life. So if we used 4 Gitaxian Probes to recycle for new cards, and we used 4 Street Wraiths, that would take 16 of our 20 life. But in many strategies of this first turn win thing, that's worth it. Life loss or gain is less important than the Magic people thought, because card advantage and getting the right cards can be worth a continual, way to destroy the opponent, as more than a single shift one way or another. And in this context, losing 16 life is going to be worth having 8 free cards. These are the cards, essentially. This one is a creature, but it has cycling. But its cycling cost doesn't cost mana like many do. Cycling means you discard it to draw a new card. Usually that costs mana. This one costs 2 life. They didn't print that again. They even may have had to ban it in many formats, because remember, in our game, we're not banning cards like formats do, but some formats are more restrictive because they don't want to get anywhere close to what we're going to achieve. We're achieving decks that, if I turn this into a 60-card deck, it could, win on the first turn against certain other decks, 90% of the time. And maybe they have a bunch of counter spells or whatever in that format that could somehow trick out and stop it, but they still don't want to get close to that in most formats. They want people to, make it a few turns into the game and have a little back and forth. So this one cycles for 2 life. This one's similar. This is a cost that, ooh, guess what? Golden ratio symbol. Fee, the golden ratio symbol. Now, yep, it is even called Phyrexian mana, which is probably named after that. And that can be paid with either a blue mana or 2 life. So you can pay 2 life. Look at their hand. That we don't care about that in this particular challenge. Draw a card, though. That matters, importantly. If we draw another card, we recycle it. And it's almost like blank. So you have to be careful, because there's certain strategies that if you had other cards in your deck that were like, look at the top 5 cards of my deck, look for something within those. Well, if I have these in my deck, the top 5 cards could all be those. So they're not fully blank under every strategy. But with the certain mixes of cards, they're functionally blank. If the other cards just say I have Ancestral Recall, because yes, I am going to include Ancestral Recall, the way too overpowered one from that cycle in here. And that one we're going to draw 3 cards, and if we draw any of the ones that just filter for a new one, then we just filter them for a new one. So we get kind of 8 blank cards as long as our strategy is okay with us being at potentially 4 life. Potentially these could be the first cards we draw on top of our deck, and we have to use them all to get a real hand. So our strategy has to be okay with us being at 4 life to start, but that's going to be worth these 8 cards in most arrangements of this. So that's where I started, thinking that we can use those 8, and that those are going to help us overcome this challenge of having, like, I can't have 7 eat mana ones and 7 make mana ones unless they're double tasking or something. But even that gets hard, because let's say I have 6 mana resources. Well, let's say which ones we're going to have. To keep it nice and simple, what we're going to use is going to be 2 Lotus-y things. We're going to use the most expensive card of all time, called Black Lotus, and we're going to use 4 of those. So, let me get these. We're going to use the maximum of Black Lotus because it's too good. This looks like a weirder reprint. Where's the original look at this? So, this one is way too good of a card. Sacrifice it, add 3 mana of any color, and it costs 0. So, it just like speeds up your first turn like crazy. And that's what we need, because we're only using our first turn in this challenge. So, somebody says I'll have to disallow Unhinged and Unpeeled or whatever because of rocket-powered Turbo Slug. That's something with this silly ability called like Super Haste or something that lets it attack the turn before it comes into play. I don't think I looked at those. Those would be a way to, if we weren't restricted to 4 copies of it, but I don't even think those would help us. If you can try and put those in a deck. If anyone has a challenge answer that like is 20 or more cards here that uses those as part of it, then I'm willing to hear that. They're allowed, I'll say, because I said earlier they're not, but we'll say they're allowed, because I don't even think they help because in this challenge, because you have to remember that those could be the bottom 4 cards of your deck. Yeah, you have to look at worst case scenarios, and we're up to 4 of each card in the worst case scenario answer. Now, here, what else we have is we're going to have 4 Black Lotuses, and we're also going to put one called Lotus Petal, whereas these are just all the Black Lotuses. We want Lotus Petal. What? No, I don't want all this stuff in front of it. Okay. So this is, they reprinted Black Lotus as 1/3 as powerful, and it was still too good. They still had to ban and restrict this in a lot of places, even though they tried to reprint it and it only giving 1 mana. This one gives 3. This one only gives 1. And this card Black Lotus is so overpowered that even making it 1/3 as good is the other thing we're going to use in the deck. There's like nothing in between these in power for what we need to achieve here of having 2 mana of any color. They even knew that would be too powerful by the time they printed this. And after this, they're like, oh, damn it. Even this was too powerful. But we're going to probably use one of these in our deck as well. But here's the thing. If you started off with 4 Black Lotus and 2 of these, you're like, okay, I don't have 7 lands or 7 mana resources. And we're going to have to demonstrate these somehow. So we'll say that artifacts are going to be our add 3s, our Black Lotuses, and planes are going to be our Lotus Petals. So let's see. Where's another artifact? Okay, here. So let's say that I have 4 of what we're going to pretend are Black Lotuses and 2 of what we're going to pretend are Lotus Petals. Well, I might think that I'm good because no matter how I draw it, I can't get only mana resources. I can set up my other stuff to be a combo and stuff. But here's the problem. If I have even just a 2-card combo that can win the game on its own, if I only draw 1 of those cards in the combo and my 6 resources, it doesn't seem like it's going to work. Now I did overcome this. But first, let's look about where I was at the brainstorms like a week ago. I was like, I can't think of... There's certain single cards that with all this mana could win, but I can't think... Then those cards wouldn't work if I had them and like other draw resources in the other 6 and my win conditions at the bottom of the deck, and I get all the mana and have to use it to draw stuff, and then I don't have enough mana for the thing. I couldn't find like a 1-card win at first that fit with the mana and did all that. But that would still fit with the mana even if we had to use a bunch on the other cards to draw our stuff. However, I got past that, but let's start with then saying, like a week ago, I figured, okay, we'll have 5 of these. And we're going to have a 2-card combo of some sort. That even if we get the less effective of the 2 cards of the combo and all of the mana, then we're going to either also get the other combo card or some sort of draw card we've set up. So then I'm like, okay, well, we're going to want a bunch of those ancestral recalls, although they draw 3 cards at a time. So we have to be careful because we have a limited deck size. You can't overdraw. If I have 2 cards in my deck and an ancestral recall, I could be screwed if I have only 2 copies of some important card because they could be at the bottom. Now, let's say these are ancestral recalls, and let's say that this, well, in this circumstance, I had 2 combo pieces, and we'll say the green ones are our combo pieces. So now, even if I draw all 6 of these, I'm going to get at least 1 mana resource with them. So with the mana resource, I could trigger an ancestral recall and draw more and continue. And this worked for a minute. There are 2-card combos that can do that. And I forget if at this stage I had to substitute any ancestral recalls for other cards that don't draw 3, because you have to be careful about not overdrawing. But something similar to this, where some of these may have been replaced with other draw spells, worked. And there's a lot of 2-card combos that could work to achieve that. I'll give some more examples when I turn this into a full episode on my main combo class channel sometime. But for now, I'm going to go toward my next innovation, which was maybe there's some card that can like search for other stuff and help me. There's these cards that are called like tutors of different sorts, named after this old one called Demonic Tutor, that lets you search your deck for stuff. And then I came upon these cards that were called something Wish. And for example, there's this one called Burning Wish that we're going to be looking at here today. This card, a lot of Black Lotuses. This card says something strange to new players. You may choose a sorcery card you own from outside the game. And now here's the thing. When you look at what this means in the rulings, it says if you're playing a casual game, that means any card you own is okay. And if you are playing a tournament, it means a card from your sideboard. Those 15 cards I mentioned earlier that normally you only substitute in between games. But here, you can do it during a game. Now, we're not going to need up to 15 cards if we use a strategy involving these. So whether we say we're allowing a sideboard or we say we're allowing this under casual play restrictions, this, if we just allow it in general, which I don't see why we wouldn't, it's printed in a normal set, will let us do something interesting. If we set up the right combo with this, my first thought was, if I put a few of these in, and then I draw one of them too early, I could get a draw spell from outside the game and draw more cards. And if I get one of these late enough or with the right combo, I could get a combo piece from outside the game to do that. And then I improved it even more, and I found a way that if we use a copy, we'll call this red one Burning Wish, we'll pretend it's that, and we then go back to 2 Lotus Petals. So for our mana resources, we're going with 2 Lotus Petals. Now, I'll note for anybody who is going to try this on their own and try and make their own decks, that the Lotus Petals are not set in stone that you'll want those. The Black Lotuses are so good, it's going to be hard to not want 4 of those. But the Lotus Petals could be exchanged for something called Mana Crypt, or it's either Mana Crypt or Mana Vault, I forget which one, costs 0 and gives you 2 colorless. So there's some things that instead of giving us 1 of any color, could give us 2 colorless ones that only help us with like that part of the cost, the colorless. Or I guess we'd call it generic mana now that they've actually made colorless a separate thing. But those won't fit in what I did right here. But that's something to consider. You might want that Mana Vault or whatever, Crypt or whatever, as possible other substitutions for these. But what I had here was realizing there's a way I can make it work with all of these and some Burning Wishes and some Ancestral Recalls. And first I have to explain what my weird strategy is for when we get a Burning Wish. Now this strategy is cool because even with these overpowered cards, we have a limited amount of mana. We expect that since I can't pass 6 mana-making cards, unless I have special strategies to get them back or whatever, these each can make 3, and I get up to 4 of the Black Lotus, so that makes 12. These each can make 1, or I could substitute it for something that makes 2 generic, like I said. Here, this will be enough. So here, this is going to make 14. So it's kind of hard to make a combo that you know will not only go off in 14 mana, but go off in 14 mana minus whatever other stuff you have to spend on draw spells you draw early and stuff like that. So now, if I have all these, and these are 3 Ancestral Recalls, and these are 3 Burning Wishes, this one is the one that I have, one of, not the furthest level, but this is the furthest level that I'm pretty sure about. After this, there's one that there's another one I'm pretty sure about. This one I am closer to sure about. It's hard to prove this. I did it pretty quick because there's a lot of combinations. If you look at how many ways this deck could be ordered, for example, you could try and simplify it by saying that some of them are copies of each other, but to get a bigger scale, like easier answer and say we're calling them Black Lotus A, Black Lotus B, Black Lotus C, and etc., then the amount of ways it could be ordered would be the amount of cards factorial. And so and otherwise, it's a kind of hard formula to plug in to get the exact amount of orders of 3 copies, 4 copies, 2 copies total. But just the factorial, like if we treated them as differently, if I have these, and what I forgot is we do still get those 8 blank cards. Those still fit in. We'll say, we don't even need to put them in because I want to show this without them, but we get 4 Gitaxian probes and 4 street wraiths. Those work with this strategy. So that is 8 more cards. So with this right here is 12 cards. And with those 8, this is a 20 card deck that I am pretty sure would always win on the first turn. And we can take it further. But I first need to explain what we do with these wishes, because how do we actually win with them? It's a sort of interesting whole strategy. What we need is 2 Black Lotuses, and we need one of the Lotus Petals, but it could have even been used already. Or we even could have played one of the Gitaxian Probes. We need something else we've played already. And we'll say that it's a Lotus Petal we've used on an Ancestral Recall, which is, you know, something that would be common in this deck, to draw 3 more and get the rest of the stuff. We need to have had a Lotus Petal that we either have in, well, let's just say it's in play, actually, but it could have been used. And we need 2 Black Lotuses. And we need our wish. Now, first, what we're going to do, and I need to balance the size of this, so here's what we're going to do. I'll be bigger over here, and the card will still be there. So, I'm going to use a Black Lotus. Gives me 3 mana. I'm going to make red mana. And I'm going to use the Burning Wish. Now, the sorcery I'm first going to get is this one called Yawgmoth's Will. This thing says, until end of turn, you can play cards from your graveyard. This is the zone of things that have been sacrificed or killed. If a card goes into your graveyard after you've played this, then you exile it. That means it's like removed from an exterior zone that's in the game that's like, used to be called removed from the game, but it's technically in the game, so they stopped calling it that. Okay, I dropped one of the cards. I'll get that later. But it's like a zone that's harder to touch in the game, like Super Dead. But here, until end of turn, any cards that are already in the graveyard we can play. So I get one of these, because it's a sorcery, from my Burning Wish into my hand. Now, and the Burning Wish is in the graveyard now, because I played it. Now, I haven't played Magic in a long time, and I went through this. So somebody correct me if at some point, for some reason, I'm wrong on this. But I think this should work. Now, this, when we play the Yawgmoth's Will, we need to first use the other Black Lotus to cast it. So this time, I'm making black mana. I also happen to still have an extra red mana hanging around. It could be useful later. But I'm going to make 3 black mana here and use that to play the Yawgmoth's Will. Now, until end of turn, I can play cards from my graveyard. So, that means I can replay all this stuff. So now I got a ton of mana. I can make 3 more black and 3 more red. Now I've got a bunch of red mana and 3 black. Now, I'm also going to replay the Wish from my graveyard, because that was in my graveyard, so I can replay it until end of turn. So that uses a red mana, or 2 of the red mana, or whatever. And it now lets me wish for another card outside the game that's a sorcery also. Now, the one I'm going to get is one somebody did mention, called Tendrils of Agony. This is a somewhat overpowered card that they regretted making. This effect called Storm is a bit overpowered. You copy it for each spell played before it that turn. So usually you can't go this crazy in one turn with how much stuff you've played. But if you can, then your Storm stuff goes crazy. This says target player loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. Now, I have enough mana for this, because I can use 2 of my extra red and 2 of my black, or something along those lines. There's definitely enough mana. And once I play that, my Storm count is super high, because I've played this one twice. This one twice, once. This one I can have played twice. And then I can play the new one. So the Tendrils of Agony one. So that gets me up to 20 life they lose, and they would lose an extra 2 if I had played other stuff. So once I get the wish with the 2 Black Lotuses and the extra Lotus Petal or whatever, or extra Gitaxian Probe, then we're set. So the other step was to prove, does this always win? And here's how I justified it. I was like, okay, we're going to treat the other cards as not there because I designed this strategy very particularly so that those can be treated like free cards, the ones that cycle. Now, if I start out of my functional cards, we're just going to be treating these because any other ones I would just use the 2 life to get a new one. And there's only 8 of them, so I'm not going to run out of life. If I start with an ancestor... Well, actually, I'm not going to go through the whole proof. It'll probably take a minute. Anyone can leave their own shorter proof if they want in a comment of why we would always be able to draw the wish and the right amount of mana at the time and get the right storm count. But the way I justified it was by saying there are like 2 paths. I either do or don't start with an Ancestral Recall in my hand. I will definitely start with a mana resource in my hand because there's only 6 non-mana resources and I draw 7. And so, should be 3 of those. And so, if I start with an Ancestral Recall, I could use it, and then I draw 3 more, and that leaves only 2 cards left in the deck. In this one, I designed it so that there's 3 of the Wish ones, so even if there's 2 cards left in the deck, I can get at least one of these always. And even if there's 2 cards left in the deck that are my Black Lotuses, I still would have enough mana, because there's all this other mana stuff, and I would have only used 1 of them on an Ancestral Recall. So I went through a whole little proof process of how I believe this is with the 8 extra free-ish cards. And to make it really clear, I will note exactly what it is. You have this on your sideboard. You have this on your sideboard. You have 4 of these. You have 2 of these. And you have 3 of these. And you have 3 of these. Now, so, by the way, just about the comments, somebody said, where's the name Convo Class come from? Somebody said, they said that I said, growing up, I like to combine different snacks like chips and Cheetos. That is not where the word Combo Class came from. I said that combining snacks, I would say combo. That was one of the places where, so that is a good memory about something I mentioned, that I used to like combining, I didn't say Cheetos, but I would like combining different snacks. But that was just one of many places where I would think of the importance of a combo in my past. Another of those places is magic card combos that you can create. This is not one of the main combos. It's sort of, they work in conjunction in a cool combo, but the word combo itself sometimes is used to mean what some call an infinite combo, and you better should call an arbitrarily large combo, because you can't name infinity in the game. You have to be like, I make 1 million damage or whatever. But there are some combos that can go arbitrarily large in a certain thing, like generating mana or dealing damage or gaining life, and or even creating an infinite but not infinite, arbitrarily large. You got to pick a number. And you can't say arbitrarily large either. I just mean that's what you're allowed to, that's the scale of it. Should be used as the term. But we'll do another episode someday about the coolest infinite combos. This is a separate challenge. What I want to note next is, not only do I think those 20 cards achieved, oh, and we have 4 of the one I showed called Gitaxian Probe and 4 of the one I showed called Street Wraith. Now, not only do those 20 work, but I think we can go further. Now, some of this requires substituting the ratio of some of these, or filtering in other types of draw things. Like some cost X in the title. They're variable, and they cost X and a blue or two, and let you draw X. Those I thought could be useful. There are other ones if we need to generate colorless or generic mana to generate more of it with something, that could let us draw for a single colorless, could replace a card, or other colorless things could help us draw, possibly. And there's also other sorts of cards that could come in handy here. But the main way I saw to expand this is with a few lands that will let us sort of filter for another card. There are many lands that have cycling, that we can only play one land per turn, by the way. But many lands have what's called cycling, and that lets you like replace them for a new card. But a lot of the lands that have cycling come into play tapped, meaning you can't use them on the first turn. And that won't work, because if the whole point of adding more land type stuff is that we get past requiring 6 to be our cutoff of mana resources. Because if I have another land that I like can't cycle or anything, and I draw it with these ones, then I'm screwed. But if I get one that comes into play tapped, then it's like only for cycling, and a card that's only for cycling, that's not those magical free ones that only cost life, most of it costs mana to cycle, could get stuck with like whatever other 6 I have here. And if I'm replacing these, I'm not actually adding to my deck size. I want to add to 6. I want 6 that are combo pieces and draw cards, and then I want to somehow add to that. You know, otherwise replacing them isn't getting me anywhere. But the ones that I thought we could add are, there's a few lands that don't come into play tapped that cycle. Now, one of them is this one I didn't work in yet. I forget. It's called like a Wasteland or something. No, it's not that one. Wait, what's the other one called? I forget. There's one that I didn't work in as much, but there's one cycling land that doesn't come into play tap that adds a colorless mana, or you can cycle it for 2. You can pay 2 to get a new card. So that could maybe work. It wouldn't work with these, because if you got stuck with it in these cards, you can't use a colorless to pay for Ancestral Recall. And so it wouldn't work in this case, but you could replace some of these with colorless draw things, maybe. But another even better one I saw is, and there's 2 more. One that I think will extra work is this one called Fiery Islet. Now, we might only be able to fit one of these if this is what we're using, because if I had my 6 resources and one of those, I can play it, play another thing, pay 1, tap it, sacrifice it, and get a new card. And it was like a free card that added just 1 to my deck, but that's important in this challenge. But I can't have 2 of them, because if I did that and drew another of them, I can only play 1 land per turn. And it has to be played to do its ability. It has to be in play to do that. Now, another one that this is probably the newest of the ones that have come out, I think, that they're printing new stuff that is upping the size that we might be able to get away with over the years. And I'm wondering if someday they'll get to the point where it reaches 60 or reaches 40, like the old school deck sizes. We were at 20, but I'm pretty sure we can add one of these. If somebody wants to try and whip up a little proof of logic that makes them think that other deck I showed exactly with one of these would still work, I think it does. But I haven't gone through as many justifications about it yet. Now, I think we might even be able to, instead of one of these, get away with maybe 2 or 3. Now, this next one would require a lot of changes in the cards we do have. But I think that if we switch those around a bit somehow, we might be able to get away with this other one called Seagate Reborn / Seagate Restoration. Now, this one's kind of cheap. This one has 2 sides. It has a land side and a sorcery side. But they have some cards that do that. They had them a while ago, like printed on the same card. In this case, it's on different sides of the card. But technically, we should allow this. It's from a main set. And This one doesn't come into play tapped. There's a few types of these land. You could look at the other ones to see if they help too. One cycle that doesn't come into play tapped, but has a sorcery or instant or whatever on the back of it. Now, we can pay 3 life if it enters the battlefield, and if we don't, it enters tapped. 3 life's all we have to spare. I said we could lose up to 16 life with those free cards, 8 times 2. So if we lose 3 from this, we'll be at 1 life. But that's okay. We can have that work. If 1 life is the worst case scenario, that still works. It's not 0. So it can add an island if we pay that 3 life. Or it can draw cards equal to the number of cards in your hand plus 1. But here's a problem. It costs a lot. It costs 7 mana, 4 of any type, plus 3 blue. Now, I think we might have enough mana to pay for 1 of these, and maybe even then 1 Ancestral Recall, and then still do the Wish, but we might need to substitute some of the Lotus Petals or stuff, and I think we might even be able to get away with having a couple of these. I think that going through the logic, if we had to use this in a worst case scenario, it would be that we have 2. If we don't have enough mana, we could use this for 3 life to be mana. And then even if we draw a couple more of them with, say, the Ancestral Recall we use, if we're stuck with all the non-mana stuff, and this would get us something new. So we can't have 3 more of them, because we could draw 3 more with the Ancestral Recall, and then we're like, okay, I can't play a second land, or lose another 3 life in case I had all the free ones. But we could maybe have 2 more of them, have 3 of these, and then even if you had to use an Ancestral Recall, you'd draw past it that way. Because the other worst case scenario would be if you have your 6 mana resources, and this, and then you're like, oh, all mana, except I can flip it and actually use it for that, if I have enough mana in that. And then I would draw maybe 4-ish cards, I think, would happen in some circumstances. Really will vary. So, could we work in some of these is the next level of where I was at on the challenge. I'm pretty sure that if we add that one called Fiery Islet, I have a 21 card deck that works. I have some hypothetical ones that incorporate this, but I have a few different draft ones. I'm not sure which one makes the most sense, so still working on it. Now, thank you all for joining me and looking at this. If anybody watches this and does want to play around with it, I think even just by resorting the cards we have in the deck and maybe mixing in a few others that could come in handy. This one is a draw 1 for 1 colorless. This one, but you can't just shove these in, because if you have 6 mana eating ones and you put this in, you're screwed, because it does cost a mana. It has to be in the mana eating family. So we also could consider putting in more 0 mana spells, but those are harder to get away with having them help us draw something right away. And we can get away with this one might help. Well, something like this might help. Oh, no, that wouldn't help. But there's some, if we don't want Ancestral Recall, we might have to do something like look at the top 3 cards that wouldn't kill us if we, this one up there, if we had too few cards in the deck. You have to be careful with the Ancestral Recalls that you're not going to be stuck with your stuff at the bottom and overdraw and die. So another way to help with that could be something like, something like this, an X spell of some sort related to drawing. There's one that costs 1 less blue that makes both players draw X. I guess we could allow that because we can assume that maybe it's okay to let them draw the X2 in the challenge. You know, whatever you can come up with, we'll say is allowed for now at least. But other ones that could help could be these like tutor cards, like Demonic Tutor there. There's also a general one called Wish that is like Burning Wish but doesn't have to get sorceries, if that helped for some reason. But it costs 1 more. So Burning Wish worked and cost 1 less. There's other ones that could come in handy as well, but I'm not going to go through a 1,000,000-page list. So if anybody works on that, I would be excited to hear in a comment or whatever your thoughts on how we could take this further, and if throwing in a few of those Seagate Reborn Restoration ones could work. And if you think you want to confirm or deny if throwing in a Fiery Islet to that other one works or not. So that's a challenge I'm working on. There are other fun things that I've sculpted out as possible bonus videos. Like I mentioned, infinite combos is a fun one. Other aspects of the game design that are interesting over it being the biggest and longest of this sort of game, and showing a sort of lesson in history of things the designers would have changed, things they got right, and etc. Now, I would go on for a lot longer, but it's getting quite dark and late out here. I think I'm going to wrap up the stream shortly, but thank you all so much for joining me to think about this for a minute. We'll talk more about this another day. I just kind of thought it was an extra good day to talk about it, while yesterday was the 30-year anniversary of this. And next time, maybe we will look at the Ice Age rules, and I'll explain banding. An old ability that I wonder if they also explain bands with other, which is like another ability. There's a few abilities that got left by the wayside. So this book, I'll look through and see what's different about it from current rules that's funny. Now, we'll also look at some more other random cards in the future. But for those who are ready for another main episode, we do have a very fun snack break, but a really important one. So even if you just like math episodes, you got to watch this snack conspiracy snack break episode. They'll be coming out probably tomorrow on the Combo Class channel. So stay tuned for something pretty soon on there. That will be a pretty wild episode. And I've already filmed half of the episode after that, which is back to some number theory. So thank you all for joining me. Thank you especially to everyone here in the comments. Love you all so much. And I'll catch you again.